Kenneth. Kenneth, please. Chai.
Look at that child.
What is happening?
One step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Across the compound, heads turn from the grave to the child.
David.
You see that? That child walked on his father's burial day. That is a sign. That child belongs to this family, not to her.
He belongs to me.
You brought death into this house. You came here with nothing and now my son is in that box. That child stays here. You can go.
Sandra, you cannot stay here.
I am going nowhere.
That was the day Sandra learned what kind of woman she was going to have to become.
Sandra had married Kenneth Okafor on a Thursday in November in a small ceremony in Enugu that cost more love than money. Kenneth was a civil engineer with a quiet laugh and a habit of humming when he was happy. Sandra was a primary school teacher who graded papers at the kitchen table every evening while Kenneth brought her tea without being asked. They were not wealthy. They were not extraordinary. They were simply two people who had chosen each other completely, and that had felt like more than enough. When Sandra discovered she was pregnant, Kenneth drove to her school in the middle of the day just to hold her face in his hands and say nothing. No words, just his eyes and his hands, and the kind of silence that carries everything. That was the man he was. That was what she had. David was born on a Tuesday, small and loud and perfect. Kenneth held him first, stood by the hospital window with his son against his chest, and Sandra watched from the bed and thought, this is it. This is the life I was meant to have. 40 days later, Kenneth was dead. A blood clot, silent and sudden and completely without warning. He had complained of a headache after dinner. He had gone to lie down. He had not woken up. The doctor used words that Sandra's ears received, but her mind refused to hold. She sat in that hospital corridor with David strapped to her back, milk still drying on her blouse, and she could not make her body understand what her ears had just been told. Kenneth's family arrived within the hour. They did not come quietly. His mother, a large commanding woman the whole family called Mama Okafor, walked into the room. The hospital, with 3 of Kenneth's brothers and 2 aunties whose faces Sandra had only ever seen at Christmas. They filled the corridor with noise and grief and something else, something Sandra could not name yet but would come to know very well in the weeks that followed. The burial was set for 6 weeks after the death. 6 weeks in which Sandra lived in Kenneth's family compound in Enugu because she had nowhere else to go. Her own parents were in Port Harcourt, elderly and unwell, unable to travel. She had no siblings nearby. She had her son and her grief, and a small room in a house full of people who looked at her the way people look at something they are deciding whether to keep or to discard. Mama Okafor did not shout at her. She was too careful for that. She simply arranged things. She arranged for Kenneth's car to be moved to his brother Chidi's compound for safekeeping. She arranged for Kenneth's bank documents to be collected by the family lawyer without Sandra being present. She arranged for the conversations about property to happen in rooms Sandra was not invited into. And she arranged, quietly, persistently, for a particular story to circulate through the compound, that Sandra had not been a proper wife, that the bride price had never been fully settled, that the marriage, in the eyes of the family and of tradition, had a question mark hanging over it the size of a door. Sandra heard all of it. In a compound that full, walls had no secrets. She did not confront anyone. She was still too raw, still too deep inside the first terrible fog of grief, still waking in the night to reach across the bed for a body that was no longer there. She held David and fed him and rocked him and pressed her face into the top of his head and breathed him in, and she told herself the only thing she could manage, one day at a time. Just one day at a time. The burial day came with harmattan dust and a sky the color of pale bone. Mourners filled the compound from early morning. Women from the church, men from Kenneth's office, neighbors and relatives, and strangers who wept loudly and ate the food and spoke of Kenneth as though they had known him every day of his life. Sandra moved through it all in her black lace dress, accepting condolences, nodding, holding herself together with both hands on the inside while her face remained composed on the outside. She had placed David on a mat near the wooden bench at the edge of the compound and stepped away briefly to sign the burial papers at the table by the canopy. She was gone for less than 4 minutes. When she turned back, the compound had gone quiet in a strange way. Not the silence of grief, but the silence of surprise, the kind that falls over a crowd when something unexpected interrupts everything. Baby David had pulled himself to standing using the bench leg. His small hands gripped the rough wood. His bare, dusty feet pressed flat against the compound floor. And then, in the space between one breath and the next, while his father lay in the box 10 feet away, he released the bench and walked 3 small, unsteady, determined steps into the open air, into the middle of everything. Heads turned from the grave to the child. Sandra's heart cracked in 2 directions at once, grief and love splitting her open simultaneously, and she whispered his name like a prayer. But Mama Okafor was already speaking. She said it loud enough for every mourner, every neighbor, every auntie and uncle and church member standing in that compound to hear that the child walking on his father's burial day was a sign from God, that the sign meant the child would belonged to the Okafor family, that Sandra could go back to wherever she came from, but David would remain. The compound stirred. Some people nodded, some looked away. Nobody spoke in Sandra's defense. Not one person in that yard stepped forward and stood beside her. Sandra walked to her son. She lifted him from the ground. She held him against her chest and turned to face Mama Okafor with a stillness that was not submission. It was something older and harder than anger. "I am going nowhere," she said, and she meant every syllable. That night, after the food was finished and the prayers were done and the last mourner had driven away, Sandra sat alone in her small room with David sleeping across her lap. The compound outside was finally quiet. The canopy sagged in the still air. A generator hummed somewhere in the distance. She did not cry. She had cried enough. Instead, she thought, clearly, coldly, with a precision that surprised her. She took stock of everything she had. A teaching qualification, 7 years of classroom experience, a small savings account in her name that Mama Okafor did not know existed, her son, her health, her mind, and the absolute certainty that if she remained in this compound, she would be slowly erased. Her name questioned, her marriage undermined, her son absorbed into a family that had already decided she did not belong. She made her decision before David woke for his midnight feed. 3 weeks after the burial, Sandra left. She did not announce it. She did not argue. She did not write a letter or make a speech. She packed 2 bags on a Wednesday morning while Mama Okafor was at the market and Chidi was at work. She strapped David to her back. She picked up her bags. She walked out of the compound gate, flagged down a bus on the main road, and did not look back once. She went to Lagos. She knew one person there, a former classmate named Amaka, who had a spare room in a flat in Surulere and a generous enough heart to say yes when Sandra called from the bus station. Sandra arrived with 2 bags, a baby, and nothing else. She sat on Amaka's kitchen floor that first night after David fell asleep, and she allowed herself exactly 1 hour to feel the full weight of everything. The loss, the fear, the loneliness, the sheer size of what she had just done. 1 hour. Then She washed her face, made a list, and went to sleep. By the end of her first week in Lagos, she had visited 4 schools. By the end of the second week, she had a teaching position at a private primary school in Surulere. Less money than she had earned in Enugu, but enough to rent a single room and feed herself and David. She found a woman in the next building who minded infants during school hours for a modest fee. She set up her life with a focused efficiency of someone who understood that grief was a luxury she could not afford to drown in. She could carry it, but she could not stop moving. The years that followed were not easy. They were not meant to be easy. There were months when the money ran short and she ate less so David could eat more. And she graded papers by phone torchlight after he slept because she could not afford to run the bulb all night. There were mornings she woke before dawn and lay in the dark and missed Kenneth with a pain so complete it felt like a second bereavement happening inside the first. There were days David cried for a father he could not remember, and Sandra held him and told him stories, true stories, careful stories, stories that gave the boy a father worth knowing even from beyond. But she did not stop. She registered for an evening diploma in education administration. She completed it in 18 months while working full-time and raising David alone. The school promoted her to head of department. She began tutoring students privately on weekends. She saved. She planned. She applied for a position at a larger, better-paying school in Victoria Island. She got it. She moved. She saved more. She planned further. David started primary school, then secondary school. He was bright, quietly, seriously bright, with his father's calm focus and his mother's fierce precision. He did not know the full story of the burial day, not yet, but he knew his mother had carried him out of something and into something else, and that knowledge lived in him like a compass. Sandra did not contact Mama Okafor. She did not contact Chidi or any of the brothers. She had no argument with them. She had simply removed herself from a place where she was not valued and built something in a place where she could be. There was no bitterness in it. Bitterness would have cost her energy she did not have to spare. 5 years after she left Enugu, she received a message through a relative. Mama Okafor was unwell. The family had fallen on hard times. Chidi's business had collapsed. The compound, which had once been full of noise and certainty and people who made decisions about other people's lives, was now quiet and diminished. The message did not ask for anything directly, but the implication was clear. Sandra read the message twice, then she set her phone down and went to check on David's homework. She did not respond that day, or the next. She needed time, not to decide what to do, but to decide what kind of woman she wanted to be when she did it. She had not survived these years by being reckless or reactive. She was not going to start now. 2 weeks later, she drove to Enugu. She drove herself in the car she had bought with her own money, with David sitting quietly in the back seat. He was 7 years old now, steady and watchful, with his father's eyes. She had told him some of what had happened, carefully and without poison, enough so he understood, not so much that it made him hard. The compound looked older, smaller. The paint on the walls had faded. The big canopy that had filled the yard on the burial day was long gone. Mama Okafor sat in a plastic chair by the door, thinner than Sandra remembered, her gold earrings replaced by plain ones, her commanding presence reduced to something quieter and more tired. She saw Sandra and her face did something complicated. Sandra walked across the compound, the same compound where she had stood alone holding her baby with the coffin behind her and not one person at her side. And she sat down in the chair opposite Mama Okafor and said nothing for a long moment. She let the silence do what it needed to do. Then Mama Okafor said in a voice that had lost all her old authority, "You came back." Sandra said, "I came back." I said terrible things to you on that day, with everybody watching. I said things no woman should hear. Sandra looked at her. Yes, she said simply. You did. I was in pain, Mama Okafor said. I was losing my son, and I looked at you and I took it out on you. I know that now. I have known it for a long time. Sandra was quiet. Outside the compound gate, she could hear David kicking a stone along the road, the small rhythmic sound of a child who had learned to occupy himself without being asked. Sandra said finally, I did not come here to punish you, and I did not come here to pretend that what happened did not happen. I came because David is Kenneth's son, and Kenneth's son should know where his father came from. That is the only reason. Mama Okafor looked at her grandson through the gate for a long moment. When she turned back, her eyes were wet. He looks like him, she said. I know, Sandra said. She stayed for 3 hours. She let David sit with her grandmother. She ate the food that was offered without making it a gesture of forgiveness or a gesture of war. Just food, just an afternoon. Just 2 women and a child in a compound where grief had once made everyone cruel and time had made everyone smaller and more honest. When she stood to leave, Mama Okafor held her hand and said nothing. She did not ask for money, she did not ask for monthly visits or reconciliation or any of the things Sandra had half expected. She simply held her hand the way very old people hold the hands of the living, briefly, tightly, with full knowledge of what it means to let go. Sandra walked back through the compound gate. David ran to her side. She took his hand and they walked together to the car. And as she buckled him in, she looked at his face, Kenneth's eyes, her jaw, his father's quiet focus, and she thought, we are all right. We are more than all right. She started the engine. She pulled out of the street. She did not look back at the compound. She had stopped looking back a long time ago. There is a kind of victory that does not come with noise. It does not arrive with crowds or celebrations or people who once doubted you lining up to say they were wrong. It comes quietly, the way dawn comes, not announced, simply present. You wake up one morning and the weight you have been carrying has shifted. It has not disappeared. Loss does not disappear, but has found its proper place inside you, and what surrounds it now is not emptiness. It is everything you built while you are carrying it. Sandra built a life. She built it alone, 1 year at a time, one decision at a time. One morning when getting up felt like an act of defiance against everything that had tried to keep her down. She did not do it to prove anything to Mama Okafor or to Chidi or to the compound full of people who looked away when she needed someone to stand beside her. She did it because David deserved a mother who was still standing. She did it because Kenneth had held her face in his hands and said nothing. And in that silence, she had understood that she was worth something. She had never let herself forget it. On the drive back to Lagos, Sandra fell asleep in the back seat with her head against the window. The road stretched out before her, the afternoon light long and golden across the tarmac. Sandra drove. She hummed quietly to herself, a habit she had picked up without noticing, the way you pick up the habits of the people you love without meaning to, the way they stay with you long after everything else is gone. She hummed and drove, and her son slept, and the road kept going, and that was enough. That was more than enough. When Mama Okafor held Sandra's hand at the end, did she deserve that forgiveness, or should Sandra have walked away and never looked back? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to know what you think. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.